something appeared where the old story seemed closed. Why did the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA's secret war of ideas, change what people thought was buried there? June 26, 1950. West Berlin, still in ruins. Inside a theater called the Titania Palace, 4,000 people gathered to talk about freedom of thought. 200 delegates on the stage, writers, philosophers, historians, some of the most famous minds in the Western world. And sitting quietly among them, in the front rows, a man who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He was not there by accident. The gathering itself was not an accident. What was said that day would shape how millions of people read, argued, and thought for the next 20 years, and almost none of them would know who had paid for it. That is the loop I want you to hold. For 17 years, the truth of this operation stayed buried. When it finally surfaced, in 1967, it did not close the story. It opened a much larger one. Because the question it raised has never been fully answered. How many writers, artists, editors, and ordinary readers were shaped by an institution funded in secret by American intelligence, without ever knowing it? Let us go back to the theater. The date matters more than anyone in the room understood at first. June 26, 1950. While the delegates were arriving in Berlin, news reached them from the other side of the world. North Korean troops had launched a massive invasion of South Korea. The Cold War had turned hot, and here, in a bombed-out city split between East and West, a Congress about ideas suddenly felt like something more. It felt like a front line. They called it the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Decades later, the CIA would write its own history of it. The agency's in-house journal, Studies in Intelligence, published an account titled Origins of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, 1949 to 1950. And the CIA's own website would describe the Congress as, quote, widely considered one of the CIA's more daring and effective Cold War covert operations. Daring. Effective. Those are the agency's own words about an operation that targeted not soldiers, not weapons, but the minds of intellectuals. To understand why the CIA cared so much about a room full of writers, you have to understand what came before. Because the Congress was not the opening move, it was a response. The Soviet Union had already opened this front. In August 1948, in the Polish city of Wrocław, the Soviets backed something called the World Congress of Intellectuals in defense of peace. The language was gentle. Peace, culture, understanding. The purpose was strategic. Gather the prestige of Europe's thinkers and point it westward against the United States. Then they brought it to American soil. In March 1949, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace. On the program were two of the century's greatest musical names, the Soviet composer Dmitri Shostakovich and the American Aaron Copland. Music, prestige, the idea of peace itself, all mobilized in one direction. To Washington, this looked like a war being lost without a shot being fired. Because in post-war Europe, communism was not a distant threat. It was a live intellectual option. Among artists, professors, and editors, the idea carried real weight. Many of the most respected minds in France and Italy leaned left, and some leaned all the way toward Moscow. The fear inside American intelligence was simple. If the cultural elite of Western Europe drifted into the Soviet camp, the public might follow. And so the response took shape. Not propaganda in the crude sense. Not leaflets, not slogans. something quieter and far more sophisticated. A congress of free minds, presented as spontaneous, funded in secret. The declared objective was precise, not mass agitation, targeted peer pressure. The plan was to persuade European intellectuals to break away from communist front organizations and fellow traveling groups, to establish in the agency's own thinking a beachhead against communist ideas in Western Europe. A beachhead, military language, for a battle of essays and lectures. Now return to Berlin, to the Titania Palace. Look at who was in that room. The manifesto was drafted by Arthur Koestler. Koestler had once been a communist himself. He had written Darkness at Noon, one of the most devastating books ever produced about the machinery of Soviet terror. A convert who had seen the inside and turned against it. His draft was amended by the historian Hugh Trevor Roper and the philosopher A.J. Ayer, and the roster of attendees reads like a directory of mid-century Western thought. Sidney Hook, the American philosopher, Ignazio Silone, the Italian writer who had also broken with communism, Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher and logician, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the American historian, Raymond Aron, the French political thinker, the playwright Tennessee Williams, and Ernst Reuter, the Lord Mayor of Berlin himself, standing for a city under siege. These were not agents. These were not spies. For the most part, these were serious people who genuinely believed in what they signed. They opposed totalitarianism. They valued the free mind. And many of them had no idea who was underwriting the room they stood in. That gap between what they believed and what they did not know is where this story lives. Now meet the man in the front row. His name was Michael Josselson, born in Estonia in 1908, fluent in English, Russian, German, and French. Before intelligence work, his career was almost ordinary. He had been the chief European buyer for Gimbel's, the American department store, a man who understood markets, tastes, and how to move product across borders. That skill turned out to be exactly what the operation needed. Josselson was a CIA officer, and from 1950 onward, he ran the Congress for Cultural Freedom day to day. Not for a year, not for a season, for 17 years. He built it, managed it, protected it, and kept it secret until the day the secret broke. Think about the discipline in that. A man moving through the most brilliant literary circles in Europe, dining with novelists, editing magazines, attending concerts and exhibitions, and the whole time, holding a truth that none of his companions were allowed to know. Above Josselson sat the architecture of the operation. One of the men who helped design it was Thomas Braden. Braden joined the CIA in 1950, the same year the Congress was born. He became head of the agency's International Organizations Division. Years later, he described the power he had once held in plain, cold terms. The CIA, he said, could do exactly as it pleased. It could buy armies. It could buy bombs. It was, in his words, one of the first worldwide multinationals. Hold on to that phrase. A multinational. Not a spy agency in the movie sense. A vast organization moving money and influence across the globe, through channels most people would never see, and Braden gave a number. The CIA, he admitted, was channeling roughly $900,000 a year into the Congress for Cultural Freedom. $900,000 every year at mid-century value. A portion of it aimed at one specific product, a magazine. But we are getting ahead of the story. Because to move that kind of money without leaving fingerprints, the agency needed cover. You cannot simply write a check from the Central Intelligence Agency to a poet in Paris. so the money was laundered. Routed through dummy conduits, front organizations that looked like ordinary charities. The most important of them was called the Farfield Foundation. On paper, a philanthropy supporting the arts. In reality, a CIA front, funneling money into cultural operations, primarily across Europe. To a magazine editor receiving a grant, it looked like generosity. An enlightened foundation, backing serious work. The name behind the name stayed invisible, and even in these early days, the agency was already thinking about the exit. From the very inception of the Congress, the CIA tried to hand off the financial burden to legitimate philanthropies. It specifically targeted the Ford and Rockefeller foundations. The logic was cold and practical. If real foundations could be persuaded to fund the work, the agency's own money and its own risk could quietly recede. The secret would be safer the day it no longer needed to be a secret. That day would not come cleanly. But the intent was there from the start. This is the shape of the world before the network fully bloomed. A Soviet cultural offensive met by an American counteroffensive. A congress of famous names launched on the day a war began in Korea. A quiet officer from Estonia running it all. Money moving through invisible channels. And underneath it, one strategic idea that would outlast the men who conceived it. The idea was this: do not fund the crude anti-communist right. Fund the non-communist left. The socialists, the liberals, the disillusioned ex-communists. The people whose criticism of the Soviet Union would carry the most weight, precisely because it came from the left, not against it. According to the CIA's own account in Studies in Intelligence, this Berlin strategy from 1950 became the theoretical foundation for the agency's political operations against communism for the next 2 decades. 2 decades. One theory, born in a ruined theater, shaping how the United States fought a war of ideas across the entire globe. And it worked, by many measures, because it did not feel like a weapon. It felt like culture. It felt like freedom. That was the design. Before the magazines, before the offices in dozens of countries, before the prizes and the exhibitions, there was just this: a room in Berlin. 4,000 people, 200 delegates, a manifesto by a former communist, and a man in the front row who knew where the money came from and would not say. The delegates went home believing they had launched a movement of independent minds. In a sense, they had. The words they signed were their own. The convictions were real. But the platform beneath them had been built by an intelligence service, for a purpose those intellectuals were never told. And here is the question that will grow heavier as this story unfolds. Where does anti-totalitarian cultural patronage end? And where does the covert manipulation of intellectual life begin? The Congress would not stay a single event in a single theater. It would become something far larger. Offices in 35 countries, dozens of staff, more than 20 magazines, an international news service, art, music, prizes, an entire ecosystem of thought spread across continents, and at the center of it, a flagship magazine about to launch in London. Its funding structure would be worked out by 3 intelligence officers in secret. Its pages would carry some of the finest writing of the century. And for years, almost no one would know the truth about who was paying for it. That is where we go next. But hold the image of Berlin a moment longer. The rubble outside, the war beginning in the east, the applause inside the Titania Palace. 4,000 people, certain they were free, and one man in the front row, counting the cost. London, 1953. A new magazine appeared on the intellectual scene, and it was called Encounter. From the beginning, it looked like the most respectable publication imaginable. Serious essays, poetry, criticism, political argument of the highest order. It carried a kind of authority that money alone cannot buy, and its funding was a secret worked out by 3 intelligence officers. On the American side, Michael Josselson, the man from Berlin, and another CIA officer named Lawrence de Neufville. On the British side, Monty Woodhouse, of Britain's Information Research Department. Together, these 3 men designed how the magazine would be financed and distributed. The American money came through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which itself served as cover for the CIA. The British contribution arrived through quieter means. Cash, handed directly to the managing editor, or checks signed by 2 well-known figures, the film producer Alexander Korda and Victor Rothschild of the banking family. Both men knew what the arrangement really was. So picture the machinery. A London literary magazine funded by American intelligence laundered through a cultural congress, topped up with British intelligence money, arriving as cash in an envelope, or signed by a film mogul and a banker who were in on the secret. And on the page, none of that appeared. On the page, there was only the writing, and the writing was extraordinary. Encounter published Nancy Mitford, Isaiah Berlin, Vladimir Nabokov, Jorge Luis Borges, Ba H. Auden, Arnold Toynbee, Bertrand Russell, Hugh Trevor Roper. Some of the greatest names in 20th century letters, appearing in a magazine whose true paymaster was a secret. This is the part that unsettles people most. The work was genuinely good. The operation did not survive on lies dressed as art. It survived on real art, quietly steered. The talent was authentic. The convictions of the writers were their own. Only the source of the platform was hidden, and Encounter was just one node in a growing network. The first Congress magazine had actually launched earlier in France. Proofs in October 1951. Then came the others, spreading outward across the map. Der Monat in Germany, Tempo Presente in Italy, Quest in India, Quadrant in Australia, Mundo Nuevo for Latin America, Transition in Uganda, and an Arabic journal, Hiwar. More than 20 magazines in all, offices in 35 countries, an international news and features service, art exhibitions, prizes for musicians and artists, an entire world of culture humming along, much of it resting on money whose origin was disguised. And here the story reaches beyond Europe, into places the original Berlin planners may never have imagined. Because the magazine called Transition, published in Uganda, carried early work by African writers. Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and a related journal, Black Orpheus, published Alex Laguma. Writers whose fiction spoke against colonialism, against apartheid, voices of liberation appearing in outlets funded, at least in part, through a CIA-connected network. And they did not know. The writers whose words attacked empire and racial oppression were published on a platform touched by American intelligence money, without any knowledge of where that money came from. Sit with the strangeness of that. Anti-colonial literature, anti-apartheid fiction, some of the founding voices of modern African writing, reaching readers through channels quietly linked to a Cold War intelligence operation. Whatever the intent, the reach had grown far past a beachhead in Western Europe. It had become something global, and that is the scale of what Michael Josselson was holding together. Dozens of magazines, thousands of pages, hundreds of writers, editors, and artists, most of them believing they were part of an independent movement of free minds. He carried the secret for 17 years, and then it broke. In 1967, the truth became public. The CIA's funding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was exposed. The invisible hand was suddenly visible, and everything the network had built was reread through that single fact. Every essay, every prize, every issue of Encounter, now shadowed by the question of who had really paid and why. Michael Josselson resigned. The man who had run the operation since Berlin stepped away once the secret was gone. His role was over the moment it could no longer be hidden. The organization did not simply vanish. It was restructured, renamed. It became the International Association for Cultural Freedom. New name, new face. The Congress for Cultural Freedom as such was finished. But the network, the relationships, the magazines, the habits of patronage did not all disappear overnight. And that raises one of the questions this story leaves open. After the exposure of 1967, how much of the network survived, under new names, under new patrons, through funding channels less visible than before? When a secret structure is revealed, it does not always end. Sometimes it simply changes clothes. Now step back from the machinery and consider what it all means. For 17 years, one of the most influential cultural networks in the Western world was, in part, an intelligence operation. And here is the difficult truth. Much of what it produced was genuinely valuable, real literature, real debate, real resistance to totalitarian thought. The Congress did not need to publish garbage to succeed. It published brilliance. That is what makes it so hard to judge. If the operation had been crude, we could dismiss it. If the writing had been propaganda, we could see through it. But it was not crude. It was subtle, sophisticated, and often excellent. The manipulation was not in the words. It was in the silence around them. The one thing the readers were not told: who built the room they were standing in. And so the questions that opened this story remain open. How many writers, artists, editors, and ordinary readers were shaped by institutions funded in secret by American intelligence, without ever knowing it? We can count the magazines. We can count the countries. We cannot count the minds. We cannot measure how an argument shifts when the platform carrying it has been quietly chosen, or how a movement bends when its most visible voices are, without knowing it, standing on ground prepared by others. And the deeper question, the one Thomas Braden's cold words point toward: where does anti-totalitarian cultural patronage end? And where does the covert manipulation of intellectual life begin? The men who ran the Congress believed they were defending freedom, free thought, the open mind, the right to dissent. And to defend it, they built something that concealed the truth from the very people it claimed to serve: a war for freedom of thought, waged in part by keeping thinkers in the dark. That is the contradiction at the center of this file. The CIA calls it one of its more daring and effective operations. By the agency's own measures, it was. The strategy born in that Berlin theater in 1950 shaped American political operations against communism for the following 2 decades. But effectiveness is not the same as honesty, and the delegates who stood in the Titania Palace on the day the Korean War began believed they were launching a movement of their own. In their words, they were. In their convictions, they were. Only the foundation beneath them belonged to someone else. Michael Josselson took much of that knowledge with him. Thomas Braden spoke some of it aloud. The 1967 exposure revealed the outline, but the full accounting, The names not published, the influence never traced, the readers never counted, remains incomplete. We know the Congress existed. We know who paid. We know, in the agency's own words, that it worked. What we still do not fully know is how deep the influence ran. How many books, arguments, and careers were quietly shaped by a hidden hand. And whether, after the secret broke, the machinery of quiet patronage truly stopped, or simply learned to be more careful. That is where the file closes. Not with a confession, but with a question that has never been fully answered. 4,000 people in a ruined theater, certain they were free, and a man in the front row, counting the cost. The file is closed now, but there is a reason I keep returning to that image. The theater, the rubble outside, the applause inside. Because the applause was real. That is the part that will not let go of you. Everything you have heard could tempt you toward a simple verdict. Intelligence money, hidden hands, manipulation, deception on a global scale. And all of that is true. But a simple verdict would miss what makes this operation different from almost every other file in the archive. There was no forgery here, no planted lie, no fabricated genius. Kostler wrote darkness at noon before any officer approached him. Nabokov did not need a handler to become Nabokov. Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o were writing against empire because empire was real, and they had lived inside it. The talent was not manufactured. The convictions were not scripted. The Congress did not invent these voices. It found them, amplified them, and carried them further than they might otherwise have traveled. That is the uncomfortable center of the whole story. You can build something genuinely good and still hide the reason you built it. You can hand a writer a platform and let the writer speak freely and still shape the world by choosing which platforms exist at all. The manipulation was never in the sentences on the page. It was in the architecture. Which magazines were funded? Which cities got offices? Which arguments found a stage, and which did not? $900,000 a year does not have to change a single word. It only has to decide which words get a room. And that is a quieter kind of power than armies or bombs. Thomas Braden listed those too. Armies, bombs, a worldwide multinational. But of everything the agency could buy, this may have been the most lasting purchase. Not a coup, not a war, an atmosphere. A sense of which ideas were serious and which were fringe. A slow, invisible weighting of the intellectual scales, sustained for 2 decades. You cannot photograph that. You cannot put it in an inventory, which is exactly why the accounting remains incomplete. We can name the magazines: Encounter, Proves, Der Monat, Tempo Presente, Quest, Quadrant, Mundo Nuevo, Transition, Hiwar, more than 20 of them. We can name the countries, 35. We can name the front. The Farfield Foundation, a charity that was never a charity. We can even name the strategy. The non-communist left. Fund the disillusioned. Fund the credible critics. Let the criticism of Moscow come from voices Moscow could not dismiss. All of that we can lay out on the table. What we cannot lay out is the effect. Because influence does not leave receipts. When a young reader in Lagos or Kampala or Bombay picked up one of these journals, when an argument lodged in a student's mind, when a career turned on a single published essay, there was no marker left behind saying where the platform came from. The reader simply read and went on thinking, carrying, without knowing it, a fragment of a strategy conceived in a bombed-out Berlin theater. Multiply that by the countries, by the years, by the sheer number of pages, and you begin to see why the true scale of this operation can never be fully measured. You can count the money. You cannot count the minds. And then there is the ending that was not quite an ending. 1967. The secret breaks. Josselson resigns. The Congress for Cultural Freedom becomes the International Association for Cultural Freedom, a new name over the same door. The agency had wanted this exit from the very beginning. From the inception, it had tried to hand the burden to the Ford and Rockefeller foundations, to make the money legitimate, to make the secret unnecessary. So the deeper question is not whether the Congress died, it is whether the model did. Because the lesson of 1967 was not that covert cultural patronage fails. The lesson, for anyone paying attention, was that it can succeed brilliantly for 17 years before anyone notices, and that when it is finally exposed, you do not have to destroy it. You only have to rename it. Find a cleaner patron. Choose a quieter channel. A structure that is revealed does not always end. Sometimes it simply learns to be more careful. That is the thought I cannot set down. We know how this operation was built. We know how it was hidden. We know how it was exposed. What we do not know is how much of the habit outlived the headline. Whether the appetite for shaping the world of ideas from just out of sight ever truly went away, or whether it only grew more disciplined. The CIA, in its own words, calls this one of its more daring and effective Cold War covert operations. Daring, because it gambled on brilliance instead of forgery. Effective, because it worked without most of its own participants ever knowing there was an operation to work. And that is the final weight of this file. The people it used best were the ones who believed most sincerely. The delegates who signed the manifesto in good faith. The editors who thought a generous foundation had found them. The writers who spoke their truth on a stage someone else had quietly chosen. They were not fooled about what they believed. They were fooled about where they were standing. So we leave it where the documents leave it. Not with a confession that explains everything. Not with a villain you can safely hate. But with a room full of free minds, defended by a secret. A war for open thought, waged in part by keeping thinkers in the dark, and a question the archive has never fully closed. How much of what a generation believed was truly its own, and how much of the ground beneath those beliefs was laid, quietly, by hands that were never named. 4,000 people in a ruined theater, certain they were free, and a man in the front row, counting the cost,